3 days after U.S. and Israeli aircraft struck Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at a press conference and said the following: "This mission was not and has not been about regime change." Hours later, on his own social media platform, President Trump posted, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change. But if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" Those two statements came from the same administration on the same day. That contradiction is not a miscommunication. It is the center of gravity for everything that has followed, and everything that has not yet been resolved. To understand what the administration actually wants from Iran, you have to track not just what officials say, but what they demand. The stated requirements presented to Tehran are threefold: the complete end to uranium enrichment and disposal of all existing stockpiles, limits on Iran's ballistic missile program, and the termination of financial and material support for proxy militias across the Middle East, including the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Each of those demands, taken individually, would represent a significant concession from Iran. Taken together, policy analysts note, they effectively asked Tehran to abandon the three primary instruments through which it has projected regional power for 4 decades. That is not a negotiating position. It is closer to a surrender condition. And that raises a question the administration has not clearly answered. If the goal is a diplomatic agreement, why set terms that no sitting government in Tehran could publicly accept? The nuclear dimension of this dispute deserves careful separation from the regime change rhetoric, because they are not the same problem. Even though the administration has at times treated them as one. U.S. and Israeli strikes in June 2025 targeted Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. The International Atomic Energy Agency subsequently confirmed that Iran's active enrichment capability had been severely degraded. Iranian officials have acknowledged, at least in back-channel communications, that no enrichment is currently taking place. So the core proliferation threat, the one that justified the strikes, has been substantially addressed, at least in the short term, yet the military buildup in the Persian Gulf has continued. A second aircraft carrier strike group, the USS Abraham Lincoln, was ordered from the South China Sea to the region. Patriot missile systems were deployed to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. The administration has characterized this posture as leverage for negotiations. Critics of the policy point out that deploying 2 carrier groups after strikes have already achieved their stated objective sends a different signal, one that suggests the objective may have expanded beyond nuclear containment. When Trump said on February 14th that regime change would be the best thing that could happen, he was responding to a reporter's question about whether he was pressing for the ouster of Iran's clerical leadership. He did not elaborate on who he would like to see take power. He sidestepped that question entirely. That gap is significant. Administration officials argue that the United States is not engineering regime change, but simply expressing support for the Iranian people. What those officials have not explained is what support looks like in practice, or what U.S. policy becomes if the current government survives, stabilizes, and then asks, "What exactly do you want from us now?" The January 2026 protests offered a brief window in which the two questions, regime change and nuclear negotiations, appeared to merge in the administration's public messaging. Trump told protesters on social media that help is on the way. He called on demonstrators to take over state institutions. He described Ayatollah Khamenei as a sick man and said it was time to look for new leadership. Iranian security forces killed thousands of protesters in the weeks that followed. The protests were suppressed, and the administration, which had framed those protests as a potential inflection point, now finds itself in an ambiguous position. The moment passed, the regime remains in place, and the military posture has not changed. There is a domestic political logic to this language that analysts outside the administration are more willing to name than those inside it. Trump recently oversaw the removal of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power, and that operation, whatever its strategic merits, was presented domestically as a demonstration of decisive presidential action. The Iran framing echoes that presentation. References to Iran in recent White House communications have drawn a direct comparison to Venezuela, noting that the same military posture stands ready, willing, and able to rapidly fulfill its mission. That comparison, however, understates the operational differences between the two cases. Venezuela's military did not hold together behind Maduro when pressure intensified. Iran's military and security apparatus, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has not shown comparable fracturing. The IRGC remains intact, ideologically cohesive, and in direct control of significant military assets. Council on Foreign Relations Analysis and Atlantic Council assessments both note that as of current open-source intelligence, there have been no widespread defections among Iran's military, security services, or political elite. Without those defections, the conditions that allowed a rapid transition in Venezuela do not exist in Iran. The administration's own documents add a layer of tension. Trump's December 2025 national security strategy states, in direct language, that the United States should encourage and applaud reform when and where it emerges organically, without trying to impose it from without. That line was written into formal strategic doctrine. It was published. It is still in effect, and it sits in direct tension with a sitting president publicly calling for new Iranian leadership and drawing comparisons to a military operation that removed a sitting head of state. Secretary of State Rubio acknowledged at a Senate hearing that transforming a regime that has been in power for decades requires a lot of careful thinking. That phrase, careful thinking, is diplomatic language for an absence of consensus. Multiple European allies, including France, Germany, Italy, and Canada, have called for a rapid return to negotiations following the June strikes. Russia and China condemned the strikes as violations of international law. The diplomatic alignment that supported the original nuclear containment argument has not extended to support for regime change, either explicitly or by implication. That leaves the administration operating with a military posture that outpaces its diplomatic coalition, and a regime change conversation that its own allies have not joined. What this sequence of events reveals is a specific kind of strategic ambiguity, one that may be intentional or may reflect genuine internal disagreement. On one side of the administration, the argument appears to be maximum military pressure creates maximum negotiating leverage, and the regime change rhetoric is a tool, not a policy. On the other side, the public statements from the president himself suggest something more than negotiating posture. When an official calls publicly for new leadership in a foreign country, names specific leaders as illegitimate, and draws operational comparisons to a recent forced removal from power, the gap between rhetoric and policy begins to close, whether that is intended or not. Iran's government has read those signals. Tehran has described the protests and the U.S. rhetoric as part of a coordinated foreign plot. That framing has allowed the regime to justify its crackdown internally. It has also given Iranian hardliners a reason to resist negotiations, because accepting a deal under this level of pressure, with regime change language in the air, risks being seen domestically as capitulation to an existential threat. The administration wants a deal. Iran says it is willing to negotiate, but the conditions under which any agreement could be reached and could survive politically in both countries have been narrowed by the very language the president has chosen to use. The unresolved question is not whether Trump wants regime change in Iran. It is whether the administration has thought through what comes after. For any of the scenarios currently in play, if Iran negotiates, what does the administration accept as sufficient? If the regime survives without a deal, what does sustained military pressure cost, financially, regionally, and in terms of attention drawn away from other strategic priorities, including China? If protests resume and the United States does intervene, who governs next? Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the Shah, has surfaced in public commentary. Trump described him as a nice person, but has stopped short of endorsing him. That hesitation, buried inside a single press exchange, captures the entire problem. The administration has named the outcome it wants, without having publicly defined how it gets there, or what it accepts if it doesn't. What this moment actually signals about U.S. leadership is something broader than the Iran file. It is a test of whether maximum pressure, military, economic, rhetorical, can be sustained as a coherent strategy when the endpoint remains undefined, when allies are not fully aligned, and when the country being pressured has calculated that surviving the pressure is preferable to the terms of any deal currently on offer. That calculation could change. So could the administration. The Armada is still in the Persian Gulf. The talks have not resumed, and the gap between what the Pentagon said and what the president posted has not been explained.